A corrupt cop thinks he's just pulled off another easy arrest, another victim to intimidate, another payday in his pocket. But he has no idea that the woman he just handcuffed isn't an ordinary suspect. She's a high-ranking DEA agent working undercover, and his entire world is about to come crashing down. What starts as a routine stop turns into a career-ending disaster, as his dirty secrets unravel faster than he can react. Within hours, the hunter becomes the hunted, and the shocking consequences of his greed will leave everyone speechless. Stay till the end to see how a single arrest led to his ultimate downfall. Corrupt cops often believe they are above the law, but what happens when they cross the wrong person? This is the unbelievable true story of a crooked officer who thought he was in control, until he arrested a woman who turned out to be a DEA agent on a secret mission. What followed was a stunning chain of events that exposed his crimes, destroyed his career, and left him facing the justice he once thought he could escape. Stay with me as we uncover the shocking downfall of a corrupt cop. Officer Daniel Carter had built a reputation as one of the most feared cops in his small town. To the public, he was a dedicated officer keeping the streets clean. But behind the scenes, he was running a dirty operation, taking bribes from drug dealers, planting evidence on innocent people, and silencing those who dared to question his authority. For years, Carter believed he was untouchable. His influence spread through the police department, and anyone who suspected his corruption either looked the other way or mysteriously backed off. But what he didn't know was that his biggest mistake was just around the corner. It all started on a quiet evening when Carter spotted a black SUV driving through a part of town he closely monitored. The vehicle didn't fit the profile of the usual locals, and his instincts, fueled by arrogance and greed, told him this could be an opportunity. As he pulled the car over under the pretense of a routine stop, he expected to find a nervous driver, easy to manipulate. But what he got instead was something entirely different. The driver, a woman in her late 30s, rolled down the window and greeted him calmly. Her ID said her name was Sarah Mitchell, and everything about her appeared ordinary, too ordinary. She had no criminal record, no outstanding tickets, and her demeanor was unsettlingly confident. Carter, used to scaring people into compliance, immediately suspected she was hiding something. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" he asked, his tone firm. Sarah didn't argue. She stepped out slowly, watching him carefully. Carter decided to push further. "What brings you to this part of town?" he questioned. "Just passing through," she responded, her face unreadable. Something about her made Carter uneasy. Usually, when people got pulled over, they fidgeted, made excuses, or tried to explain themselves. But Sarah wasn't doing any of that. It was almost as if she was studying him instead. That's when Carter made a critical mistake. Looking for an excuse to bring her in, he found a small bag of illegal substances in her backseat, a trick he had used dozens of times before. Sarah's expression didn't change. She simply watched as Carter placed her in handcuffs and led her to his squad car. He thought he had just taken down another easy target, someone who would pay their way out or beg for leniency. But as he drove to the station, he noticed something strange. Sarah wasn't nervous. She wasn't pleading, threatening, or even showing any sign of panic. Instead, she sat back, silent, as if she was waiting for something. "Not gonna ask what you're being charged with?" Carter smirked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Sarah met his eyes and said one chilling sentence. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Carter scoffed, shaking his head. In his mind, she was just another unlucky civilian who thought she could talk her way out of trouble. But what he failed to realize was that he had just arrested a DEA agent in the middle of a federal investigation, one that had been watching him for months. And his downfall had already begun. While Officer Carter thought he was winning by arresting Sarah, what he didn't know was that the entire arrest was being watched from above. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was an undercover DEA agent involved in a high-stakes operation to bring down a network of corrupt officers and drug dealers that had been operating with impunity for years. The operation had been in the works for months, gathering evidence on the corrupt officers who were either directly or indirectly aiding criminal organizations. Sarah had been assigned to infiltrate the local police force, build relationships with the officers, and gather intel on their illegal activities. But she hadn't expected it to go like this. The moment Carter pulled her over, Sarah knew she was in for trouble. She had been briefed about the risks of going deep undercover, but nothing prepared her for this moment. The very officer she had been tracking had now just arrested her. Sarah had to stay calm, not give anything away, and continue playing her role. She knew her every move would be scrutinized, and any sign of panic would ruin her cover. What Carter didn't realize was that the DEA had been monitoring his every move for months. They knew he was a key player in a larger scheme involving drug trafficking and bribery. His record was far from clean. He had been spotted accepting money from known drug lords, protecting illegal shipments, and using his badge to intimidate witnesses. The federal agents had been biding their time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This arrest, from the moment it happened, was part of their carefully planned operation. Sarah's capture was the signal for the federal team to move in. They had been tracking Carter's movements, collecting enough evidence to bring him down, and now they had everything they needed to proceed. As Sarah sat quietly in the back of Carter's squad car, she sent out a coded message through her smartwatch. A quick tap was all it took to alert her team of her arrest, and in an instant, the entire operation shifted into high gear. Agents who had been waiting in nearby locations were mobilized. Communications were intercepted, backup was en route, and Carter's fate had already been sealed. Sarah's team, including federal agents and local officers who had been secretly working with the DEA, were all on standby, waiting for the moment when they could make their move. But for now, they had to let Carter play out his part, thinking he was in control, that he had the upper hand, unaware that he was already a target. When Carter dropped Sarah off at the precinct, he believed he was in complete control. He thought she would be one of those people who would either admit to the crime or fall apart under pressure. He didn't know how wrong he was. Sarah walked into the station as if it was just another day at the office, knowing full well that every step she took was part of a much larger plan. At that moment, a group of agents, carefully positioned outside the station, received the go-ahead to move in. The plan had been in motion for weeks, but now the operation had hit its final phase. It wasn't just about bringing down Carter. It was about dismantling an entire network of corruption that had plagued the town for years. What Carter couldn't understand was that he wasn't just dealing with a single DEA agent. He had arrested the wrong person at the wrong time, and now he was about to lose everything. What seemed like an easy win for him was in fact the beginning of his downfall. As Sarah was processed, she kept her composure. She didn't make a sound, didn't try to explain, and didn't raise any suspicion. Carter, meanwhile, was getting cocky. He had handled many cases in his time, but this one was different. He couldn't have known that the investigation he had been a part of for years was already being finalized. Within hours, the first wave of federal agents arrived at the station. They didn't knock on the door. They barged in with warrants in hand, prepared to take down the officers who had been aiding Carter's illegal activities. The plan was flawless, and Carter had no idea that his arrest of Sarah Mitchell had been the exact trigger the DEA needed to close in on him. What was even more astounding was how the agents had already infiltrated the station. Some of the officers who worked alongside Carter had been secretly collaborating with the DEA for months. They knew this day would come, but for Carter, it was just another night in his world of manipulation and control. As Sarah sat quietly, awaiting her next move, she knew one thing for certain. The real battle was just beginning. As the clock ticked on, Officer Daniel Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of smug satisfaction. He had arrested a woman who, in his mind, was just another unsuspecting criminal. The process of booking Sarah was slow, methodical, and routine. Carter had no idea that every move he made was being observed by multiple law enforcement agencies, including those who had been waiting for the right moment to expose his corruption. In the holding area, Sarah sat quietly, her eyes scanning the room with precision. Despite her calm demeanor, her mind was racing. She knew that every second she spent in the precinct brought her closer to the moment when Carter would realize that he had made the biggest mistake of his career. What Carter didn't realize was that Sarah's arrest wasn't just part of an undercover operation. It was the culmination of months of careful planning. She had baited him, and now the trap was set. At that very moment, several agents were closing in on Carter's corrupt dealings. Across the city, other DEA operatives and federal agents were simultaneously executing warrants for Carter's arrest. As Sarah had made her way into the station, the signal had gone out to her team, and their operation had transitioned from surveillance to action. Carter continued his rounds at the station, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. The police station, usually a place of relative calm, was about to become ground zero for a massive operation. Sarah had made sure the pieces were in place, and now the countdown had begun. When the first set of federal agents stormed the precinct, their arrival was not subtle. They burst through the door, moving with military precision, their badges visible and their weapons ready. The officers at the station, who had been working with Carter or had been suspicious of his actions, froze in shock. They had no idea what was about to happen. "Federal agents, hands where we can see them," one of the agents shouted, and the atmosphere in the station immediately shifted from routine to chaos. Carter, still working with his usual cocky demeanor, didn't even flinch at first. He was used to this kind of disruption. After all, he had done things like this hundreds of times before. What could possibly go wrong? But then, the unthinkable happened. A familiar voice from behind him called out, "Officer Carter, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice." Carter turned around, only to find himself face-to-face with a team of DEA agents. They weren't just here to question him, they had come to take him down. The shock hit him like a tidal wave. His hands trembled, and his confident expression faltered as he took in the situation. He had been the one arresting others, the one who controlled the narrative. How could this be happening to him? It was then that Sarah, still sitting in the holding area, caught his eye. Her earlier words, "You made the worst mistake of your life," echoed in his mind. He felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the truth. Sarah was no ordinary suspect. She was the very reason for his downfall, and everything he had done was now coming to light. As the federal agents moved in, Carter was handcuffed and led to the back of the station. His colleagues, many of whom had known about his corruption but had been too afraid to speak out, watched in stunned silence. The officer who had once commanded their respect was now just another criminal, his career in ruins. But the consequences didn't end with Carter's arrest. As agents continued their investigation, they uncovered a far-reaching network of corruption within the local police department. Carter had been only one piece of a much larger puzzle. His arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. Many of his colleagues were implicated in the same criminal activities: bribery, drug trafficking, and intimidation, activities that had allowed them to control the town for years. Sarah's quiet resolve in the holding cell had been part of the plan all along. While Carter was basking in his perceived victory, she had been patiently waiting for the moment when the entire corrupt system would implode. And when the federal agents raided the precinct, it wasn't just Carter who was taken down. It was his entire network. The drug cartel he had been secretly protecting, the officers he had been bribing, and the people he had silenced. Everything came crumbling down in a matter of hours. For Carter, the shock didn't end with his arrest. As the agents continued to gather evidence, they discovered that his ties to the cartel were far deeper than anyone had anticipated. He had been receiving protection money from major criminal organizations in exchange for helping move drugs through his jurisdiction. His actions had not only endangered the lives of countless people, but had also made him a key player in a much larger criminal enterprise. As Sarah watched from a distance, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The operation had worked flawlessly. The corrupt officers who had once been untouchable were now facing federal charges. The town that had been ruled by fear and intimidation was on the verge of a major shift. Carter had thought he could control everything, but in the end, it was his greed, arrogance, and corruption that led to his downfall. The woman he had arrested, thinking she was just another pawn in his game, had turned out to be his undoing. And as the agents continued to take down Carter's accomplices, it was clear that the town would never be the same again. The corrupt cop who had once run the streets was now just another criminal behind bars, facing the consequences of his actions. The arrest of Officer Daniel Carter was just the beginning. As the dust settled in the small town, the ripple effects of the operation began to unfold. While Carter's capture was the most publicized, it was far from the only consequence of his corrupt actions. The entire law enforcement system was now under intense scrutiny, and the town was about to face a massive shakeup that no one saw coming. The first wave of changes came swiftly. With Carter and several of his accomplices arrested, the local police department was thrown into disarray. Officers who had once stood alongside Carter now found themselves forced to reevaluate their own roles. Some were loyal to him, unwilling to believe the full extent of his corruption, but as the investigation expanded, more and more officers were implicated. The town was rocked by the realization that the very people who had sworn to protect them had been involved in criminal activities for years. Those who had relied on the police for safety now found themselves questioning everything: the integrity of their local law enforcement, the trust they had placed in those who had been hired to uphold the law. The town was left reeling from the shock of betrayal. As the investigation continued, federal agents unearthed a massive network of corruption. What had started with Carter's arrest expanded into a nationwide inquiry that spanned multiple states. The scale of the operation was far larger than anyone could have imagined. From the drugs being trafficked through Carter's jurisdiction to the bribes being exchanged with cartel members, the corruption reached the highest echelons of law enforcement. Sarah Mitchell, the undercover DEA agent who had set everything in motion, watched as the truth slowly came to light. Her mission had been dangerous, but she had never anticipated the sheer magnitude of the scandal. The truth was far more shocking than anyone had expected. For years, Carter had been a key player in an operation that allowed criminal organizations to run rampant. And now, the entire structure was crumbling beneath his feet. But while Sarah's role in taking down Carter and his network was celebrated, it wasn't without its complications. As the DEA's investigation continued, questions arose about the other officers involved, some of whom had been part of the operation for years, carefully covering their tracks. The deeper the agents dug, the more they uncovered, and it became clear that this scandal was not isolated to just one corrupt cop. As Carter sat in his cell, his mind was consumed by one question: how had it all fallen apart so quickly? In the beginning, it had all seemed so easy. He had thought that his position as a trusted officer gave him the power to control everything. But now, as the consequences of his greed and arrogance became apparent, it was clear that he had underestimated the force that had been quietly working against him. The case against Carter continued to build as more witnesses came forward, some offering damning testimony, others providing crucial evidence. It was clear that he had been at the center of a larger conspiracy, one that involved not only other officers but also criminal organizations and corrupt politicians. The web of deceit and corruption had been carefully woven for years, and now it was all beginning to unravel. Carter's trial was a spectacle in the town. It became more than just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning for a community that had been deceived for far too long. As evidence piled up, the town watched in disbelief as the full scope of Carter's actions came to light. What followed was a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The arrests and convictions of multiple officers sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers faced charges of aiding and abetting criminal activities, while others were accused of actively participating in drug trafficking and money laundering schemes. The fallout from the investigation left the department in shambles, and it took months before a new system of oversight was put in place to rebuild the shattered trust between law enforcement and the community. But even with the investigation progressing, the effects of Carter's corruption extended beyond the local police department. The town's residents were left to pick up the pieces of their broken community. Long-standing relationships were tested. Businesses that had relied on corrupt deals found themselves facing financial ruin, and citizens who had once felt safe began to question the very institutions they had trusted. The aftermath also raised critical questions about the system itself. How could someone like Carter, who had been under investigation for so long, have gone undetected for so many years? What had allowed this network of corruption to exist and thrive without anyone stepping in to stop it? These were questions that many in the town now had to grapple with as they worked to rebuild. For Sarah Mitchell, the operation had been a personal victory. She had successfully infiltrated the corrupt system and brought down the officer responsible for so many crimes. But the victory was bittersweet. The damage that Carter and his associates had caused was far-reaching, and while the operation had exposed the truth, it had also revealed just how deep the corruption ran. As the dust settled and the town began to heal, Sarah was left with a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her actions had made a difference. But she also knew that the work wasn't over. There were more corrupt officials to uncover, more criminals to take down, and more systems to rebuild. Her mission was just one part of a larger, ongoing battle to restore justice and integrity to a town that had been betrayed by those sworn to protect it. In the end, Carter's arrest and the subsequent investigation sent a powerful message to everyone. Corruption, no matter how deeply embedded, can and will be exposed. The consequences of greed, arrogance, and abuse of power were clear, and those who believed they were above the law were finally forced to face justice. But while the road to recovery would be long, Sarah's actions proved that no one is untouchable, not even the corrupt officers who thought they could control the system. The shocking consequences of Officer Daniel Carter's arrest weren't just felt by him, but by an entire town that had been living under the shadow of corruption for years. The truth had finally been exposed, and it was clear that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape justice. But the aftermath was a reminder of the deep scars left by betrayal and deceit. It took the courage of people like Sarah Mitchell to bring the truth to light. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life investigations and shocking twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more.